Just bring you a bit of more breaking news from Donald Trump. He has woken up and tweeted on his Truth Social, threatening tariffs on alcoholic drinks from the EU.
But the tariffs that Trump is imposing now on business and commerce across the borders is having a less than beautiful effect. Trump came to power promising prosperity for the United States, a new golden age, he said. Now the country is teetering towards recession.
When we heard about Donald Trump announcement, we shake, because 200% tariffs on EU wines means de facto that the US market will be closed to our wines. There is no way that EU wines will be able to reach the market.
Europe just pulled the trigger on America's important industries amidst a fast escalating trade war between the two countries. This came right after the United States threatened 200% tariffs on European Union goods, causing more tensions between the two countries. Now, economic analysts are saying that President Donald Trump's tariffs on the EU will cost businesses to lose trillions of dollars. Can any winner emerge between the US and the EU in this tariff war? EU and US tariff war escalates.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government as his escalating trade war tests the US-European relationship.
I'm not happy with the European Union, I want to tell you. And
we're
going to win that. We're going to win that financial battle.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The trade tensions between the United States and the European Union have escalated significantly, leading to several retaliations between the two countries. It first started on February 10th when President Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports affecting the European Union. Steel and aluminum exports from the EU to the US take up 7.1%. In response to these targeted tariffs, the EU fought back instantly, threatening that if these tariffs are executed, it will respond with tariffs on up to $28.33 billion worth of U.S. goods from April. By March 12th, the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum took effect. The EU carried on with its retaliation, also imposing tariffs on U.S. goods from April 1st, 2025, just one day before the separate reciprocal tariffs imposed by Trump on the EU are executed. This will cover steel, aluminum products, spirits, textiles, glass products, jewelry, machinery, vehicles, and boats. Due to the impact of the U.S. tariffs, the EU proposed reducing steel import quotas by 15% to protect its domestic industry. But Trump isn't happy about these retaliations, and he has just threatened 200% tariffs on EU goods. Trump threatens 200% tariff on EU goods.
Now, he says the European Union, one of the most hostile and abusive taxing and tariffing authorities in the world, which was formed for the sole purpose of taking advantage of the United States, has just put a nasty 50% tariff on whiskey. If this tariff is not removed immediately, the US will shortly place a 200% tariff on all, and here we go into capitals, wines, champagnes and alcoholic products coming out of France and other EU-represented countries. This will be great for the wine and champagne businesses.
As the US-EU tariff war continued to escalate, the European Union announced that it had plans to place tariffs on American whiskey. Right after that, Trump vowed that if the EU goes forward with the 50% tax on American whiskey, he would take the tariff war to the next level. He threatened a shocking 200% tariff on European wine, champagne, and spirits. Now that the EU and Trump are entering a stage of tit-for-tat tariffs over alcohol products, the impact of the trade war would affect all consumers. The import taxes are expected to increase costs for vintners, distillers, brewers, distributors, retailers, and consumers. Due to Trump's threat of a 200% tariff, a bottle of Italian Prosecco, which is $15, could increase to $45. Meanwhile, Europe's response with tariffs are also expected to increase the cost of a €30 bottle of bourbon in Paris to €45. If Trump carries on with its 200% tariffs, then it could close down many European wineries and alcohol businesses in the U.S. When responding to the EU's threat of 50% tariffs on American whiskey, Trump had called the EU hostile and abusive, claiming that they wanted to take advantage of the U.S. Every year, the EU sends more than 4.5 billion euros worth of wine each year to the US, making it its largest export market.
Place long enough, because those U.S. companies, their businesses will start to suffer. They may have to lay off workers. They may have to raise prices on U.S. consumers to make up for the loss in their exports. And then, of course, 200% tariffs against EU's alcohol, beer, just adding to the worry that these tariffs are going to implode in.
But the U.S. also relies on the EU as much. The U.S. is the world's largest importer of wine and champagne, most of which comes from the EU. The impact of the tariffs and the retaliations are expected to affect U.S. consumers. This tariff war reminds you of Trump's first term when he had announced tariffs on steel and aluminum. When it happened that time, the EU responded with its own tariffs, which included a 25% tax on American whiskey. This led to whiskey sales in the EU dropping by 20%. The tariffs were lifted after Trump left office, but now they have been implemented again. It's expected that Trump's tariffs this year will lead to a similar effect. Despite being longtime trading partners, Trump has been highly aggressive in the tariff war with the EU, saying that the world is ripping the US off. But the EU isn't sitting back. Now it just pulled the trigger on the US economy, starting with cutting its steel imports. EU proposes cutting steel imports.
The EU will tighten steel import quotas to reduce inflows by a further 15% from April. The news came from an EU official on Wednesday. It's aimed at preventing cheap steel flooding the European market after Washington imposed new tariffs. European steel producers are already battling high energy prices and competition from Asia and elsewhere. They warn that the EU risks becoming a dumping ground for cheap steel diverted from the US market, which they say could kill off Europe's plants.
The European Union has revealed its plans to tighten the import quotas for steel after Washington imposed the 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the U.S. The EU will reduce steel inflows by 15% from April, and this will prevent cheap steel from flooding the European market. Any steel imports outside the quota will have to pay a 25% tariff. Now that the U.S. is making it more expensive to export steel, European steel producers have warned that the EU could become a dumping ground for the cheap steel meant for the U.S. This could affect European domestic plants, so the EU is focused on protecting its domestic economy. Forecasts have revealed that after Trump's tariffs, producers from China, India, and Canada would try to sell their steel to Europe instead of the U.S. In 2024, the United States imported about 23 million metric tons of steel, and now exporters are looking to Europe as an alternative amidst America's import tariffs. By tightening steel imports, the EU has also signaled to the U.S. that it will take defensive measures to protect its own economy. This might pressure the U.S. to reconsider its tariffs, especially with other countries simply diverting their steel exports instead of paying the 25% tariffs. EU tariffs hurt specific U.S. states.
The European Union today also announcing tariffs against the U.S., but primarily targeting goods coming from Republican-led states.
The European Union must act to protect consumers and business. The countermeasures we take today are strong but proportionate.
The EU has announced that its retaliatory trade actions against the U.S. will cover industrial and farm products worth 26 billion euros. The tariffs will cover a wide range of goods, including textiles, home appliances, agricultural goods, bourbon, motorcycles, peanut butter, jeans, and more. The EU's retaliatory tariffs are focused on the pressure points of the U.S. and at the same time will minimize additional damage to Europe. The tariffs are also targeting Republican-held states, like soybeans from Louisiana, beef and poultry from Kansas and Nebraska, and other produce from Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia. The EU manages all 27 European countries and stated that leather goods, seafood, nuts, eggs, sugar, and vegetables will also be affected. The EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, had said that the tariffs are still open to negotiation. A recent analysis has shown that if the EU's tariffs are implemented by April 1st, 2025, it would affect more states than others in the U.S. In fact, there are some states in the U.S. that get about half of their imports from EU countries. These include Indiana and North Carolina. Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maryland, and South Carolina also get about 32% to 39% of their imports from the EU. These states also export a lot of goods to the EU and will be highly affected by the current tariff war. U.S. stocks fall after tariff war escalates.
Another brutal week for stocks.
This morning, recession fears growing as President Trump doubles down on his trade war. After a wild ride this week, the stock market falling yet again yesterday.
Well, it's been quite a roller coaster for markets.
The S&P 500 tumbling 1.4%, and in a key sign for investors, marking a notable fall, greater than 10% since its all-time high in February. The Treasury Secretary saying the Trump administration is more focused on the long-term health of the economy.
Once Trump upped the stakes in his trade war, threatening to impose tariffs on alcohol coming from Europe, the U.S. stock market took a major hit. After the news was announced, the S&P was down 1.4% midday trading, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average went down by 0.8%. NASDAQ Composite also dropped by 1.3%. The turbulence in the U.S. stock market has started since Trump became president, especially with the negative impact that the tariffs have on U.S. businesses. It's also because of all the uncertainty that Trump's tariffs have caused, and there's no telling what his next decision is. Foreign politicians and business owners have complained that Trump is too unpredictable in his tariff decisions, causing the stock market to go up and down. According to the Bank of America, global fund managers and investors are moving their funds away from the U.S. Analysts have called this the biggest drop in U.S. equity allocation ever. This is because of the pessimism about the country's economy as Trump has started a trade war, not only with the EU, but also with Canada, Mexico, and China. Now, analysts are watching to find out how bad the situation would be by April, since the EU's retaliatory tariffs will come into effect on the 1st, while Trump's tariffs on the 2nd. There's no telling how bad the tariff war between the two countries will escalate, with retaliatory tariffs going back and forth. EU businesses and winemakers fear tariffs.
We've been speaking to business owners, for example. Just talk to us about the impact.
So you need to imagine that 27% of our exports globally go to the United States, and our best wines reach the markets. I mean, U.S. U.S. wine consumers love our wines, and they have a very good tasting. So from one day to the other, we will be stopping shipping our wines there because there's no way we can sell them with 200%. Immediately, it will be a 5 billion euros stop impact. And then we need to think about the intermediate impact on wine companies, because we have to produce the wines. We have the vines, we have the grapes, we'll continue the harvest, but we don't have a place to put our wines. We don't have
Businesses and winemakers in the EU and United Kingdom are afraid of the future of their businesses amidst the tariffs imposed by Trump. Trump's threat to impose 200% tariffs on alcohol from Europe can affect the importers, distributors, retailers, and restaurants. The Italian wine sector is especially at risk, as the Unione Italiana Vini has estimated that these tariffs will result in losses of up to 330 million euros for the Italian wine industry this year, as the U.S. accounts for 24% of Italy's wine exports. In France, where independent winemakers make up 60% of the country's wine production, winemakers are concerned that they would be affected by the broader tariffs. They also expressed their fear that the U.S. will retaliate heavily against the EU due to the retaliatory tariffs. According to the head of the Independent Winemakers of France, the entire wine sector has been through a succession of crises of different kinds which have already really tested us, including the COVID crisis, inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the climate issues. Winemakers, whatever their size, but particularly small winemakers, have found themselves in a fragile position. Meanwhile, the European automotive industry has been heavily affected. Luxury car manufacturers like Bentley are planning to pass the additional cost from U.S. tariffs to the consumers. Even the steel and metal sector has been affected by Trump's tariffs, especially with the 25% tariffs recently imposed. European steel producers are concerned about how this would affect their businesses. Individual country responses.
France and Germany are presenting a united front.
Their leaders say it is more important than ever that Europe asserts and defends its interests, now that there is a new administration in the United States.
It's a matter of urgency that we use all European instruments to make sure that our companies and farmers have fair competition conditions in a world that is more brutal and
Aside from the stance held by the EU, countries like Italy, France, Germany, and the UK have spoken strongly against Trump's tariffs. Italy stated that it wants to avoid a trade war and will ask the EU to compensate economic sectors that are affected by the tariffs. The US is Italy's main trading partner outside the EU, and so it's not surprising that they want to avoid the trade war. But this might not be possible considering how badly the Italian wine sector is already affected by Trump's tariffs. The Prime Minister of Italy also warned other European partners against escalating the trade war with the US.
France will be particularly affected by the tariffs on alcohol. On Friday, its finance minister called the situation idiotic, a day after calling for cooler heads to prevail.
If there is a tariff increase from the American side, we also intend to make adjustments. However,
Meanwhile, France has a different view, saying that the EU is targeting the wrong goods in its tariffs against the US. The French Prime Minister stated that the EU had reused a very old list without rereading it, as it should have done. He believes that the EU should focus more on sectors that will harm the US more, especially since Trump might target the French wine sector in retaliation. As for Germany, the president of its central bank has announced that the tariffs on goods being imported into the US can push the country into another recession. Germany's economy has finally been recovering in the past 2 years, but the country could expect a recession this year. Without Trump's tariffs, the bank forecasts that the German economy can still grow by about 0.2%. The UK has been pretty quiet amidst Trump's attack on multiple countries, but this is not surprising, especially since the UK only makes up about 4% of US exports. Trump's 25% tariffs aren't heavily affecting the UK steel sector too, and influences less than 10% of its exports. Trade war puts trillions of dollars at risk.
European Union's been very tough. And it's our turn too, you know, we get a turn at that also.
Will you respond to their retaliation?
Oh, of course I'm going to respond.
You will retaliate.
The problem
with more
is
tariffs.
our country didn't respond. Look, the EU was set up in order to take advantage of.
Europe is pulling the trigger on many American sectors and industries, and it's not surprising as U.S. firms say that the trade war with Europe puts $9.5 trillion at risk. The damage would be far more than just the alcohol sector. American businesses are expected to be caught in the crossfire between the U.S. and EU. In 2024, the U.S. and Europe engaged in $2 trillion worth of trade in goods and services. This means that the escalating tariffs could have a widespread effect on different sectors. The EU is not holding back in its retaliatory tariffs against the U.S., especially with how badly Trump's tariffs are expected to affect its businesses. There's no telling whether Trump would follow through with the 200% tariffs on European alcohol goods, since it won't be the first time he has reneged on his plans. Where do you think this trade war will go? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.